Okay, we are live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest. This will be the third time I've talked to him. His name is Awan, and he runs the Burning Blogger blog. And I'm delighted to have him. We've talked in the past about a kind of a book that he put together titled The Libya Conspiracy. So we talked about the U.S. and Europe involvement in the destruction of Libya, and really the media oversight of the propaganda that covered or was surrounding that event. We also talked about Middle East politics in another interview, so you can go back and check those out on my podcast. I'll try to maybe upload some of those or put them back in the queue so people can listen to those. But today we're going to talk about the situation in Ukraine, what I'll call the Ukraine conspiracy. But Awan has done some great work, and you'll see this if you're watching on YouTube. You'll see some of these articles that are questioning the propaganda that's occurring around the Ukraine. He also was very prescient about the situation. He wrote about some articles back in 2014, 2016 about the situation in Ukraine and how certain things were being, threatening Russia. So I don't think that there's a lot of precedent to this event, this war in the Ukraine. I'm familiar with the Azov Battalion. He writes about the truth about the Nazism in Ukraine. I'm familiar with the Azov Battalion. Azov is actually a kind of a body of water outside of the Black Sea, just kind of southeast of Ukraine. But many of the far right that I studied when I was writing my book and still kind of following the global death cult, a lot of people from the U.S. went to Ukraine to join up with this neo-Nazi group and to get training. And some have come back. They were arrested before this whole conflict took place. But so I'm familiar kind of with the Azov, but he goes in depth about a lot of the Nazism and a lot of the context. I think he uses a phrase, and I think it was context has been surgically removed from all coverage of the situation. I think that applies to a lot of what's happening in the Ukraine. So I'm delighted to have him back. So Awan, welcome back to William Ramsey Investigates.
Thank you, William. Thanks for having me again.
Awesome. So for people who may not have heard our earlier discussions, can you kind of talk? I mean, you've done a lot of different writing on a lot of different subjects, Burning Blogger. You've been censored. Can you kind of talk about your background and kind of your coverage of the Ukraine situation leading up to current events?
Sure. In terms of background, I've said before, I have some minor background in print journalism, but nothing too big. I started the blog about 10 years ago, and it just kind of snowballed from there. Trying to basically cut through the crap of a lot of stuff and just put forward, honest, uncensored kind of investigation and research and stuff like that. And so naturally, that's led through a lot of avenues, Libya and Syria and a lot of geopolitics, and then Ukraine, obviously, being the current situation. That's obviously can't come onto the radar massively, and it's been on the radar for 8 years or so. And so the stuff that's the most recent stuff that's on the site right now is really all to do with the Ukraine-Russia thing, because that's dominating obviously all of the headlines worldwide. And there's so much, as you said, lack of context and propaganda going on in the mass media in the United States and in the UK and in Europe and pretty much everywhere. So it really requires us to really just undercut that, look beyond that, and actually try and see what's going on.
Agreed. And you actually kind of, in one of your articles, you liken kind of what happened to Libya to what was happening in Ukraine, where a lot of these Americans, at least, were on site involved in what was going on in Kiev in 2014, right?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think it's generally quite accepted that the Americans, the US State Department, had a huge hand in the Maidan Revolution in 2014 in Ukraine. And the overthrowing of the then president, I think it was Yanukovych, who was a pro-Russian president. And yeah, that's all on record. And Victoria Nuland was like the key player there for the State Department at that point. And there's leaked tapes of her basically admitting to all this. But basically, say the language she uses basically suggests that she was a puppet master in terms of who was going to be in the new Ukrainian government, who the ministers were going to be, who was going to be running it, and what direction things should take, and all of that. And then also you look at those events in 2014 and the involvement of the extreme far right and neo-Nazis and stuff like that, and it's you'd have to go a long way to convince me that someone like Victoria Nuland wasn't fully aware of all of that, all of those elements, and just went along with it anyway, herself. And I think John McCain was there in 2014 doing his thing, which again, is echoes of Libya and Syria, because I think McCain was in Libya and Syria at the start of those so-called revolutions and all of that. And, very, very similar dynamics. So where you had Libya, it was the Al-Qaeda presence that was really being covered up, and and this was being made out to be peaceful, pro-democracy protests and movements, and covering up kind of the Al-Qaeda aspect. And then in Syria, it was covering up the kind of ISIS slash Al-Qaeda jihadist aspects, in exactly the same way. And then in Ukraine, it's covering up the neo-Nazis and the extreme far right, and trying to make out that these are completely untainted, kind of innocent, just independence fighters, or independent, or volunteers even. The amount of times that they're referred to as just brave, volunteers, as opposed to armed, organized militias. It's all that removal of context that goes on, and it goes on all the time, obviously. But people say that the mainstream media is propaganda and is dishonest, and all, which is true. A lot of the time in normal times, you kind of deal with it. It's 50-50, right? But I've noticed certainly that when it comes to geopolitics, and when it comes to wartime especially, everything goes out the window, and it really does just become 100% propaganda and highly selective narratives and all of that, and that's what's been going on. I've had the displeasure of watching CNN in the last couple of weeks over here, which I don't usually do, but CNN is remarkable for how propagandistic it is. It's like a movie. It's incredible. I mean, the BBC is pretty bad, but nowhere near as bad as CNN. I mean,
right. Oh no, the CNN is terrible, and they went with this whole Trump Russia thing. So like, it just doesn't stop with this Russia demonization, and it doesn't have the context. And one of the interesting things about your writing is you kind of likened to what's happening in Ukraine recently to what happened in Syria, where you had these kind of front groups that were the fronts for Western powers, right? Like Azov Battalion and
sure, yeah.
Can you talk about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's just obvious similarities, right down to the fact that Western, US and I think Canadian and British and presumably others military, defense departments have been actually actively training these people, these Azov battalion, not only going back to the last 8 years and 2014, but even as recently as last year in 2021. So one of the articles that I've just published on the site really goes into all this Azov battalion and the Nazi problem in Ukraine, and specifically the training they've been receiving, more or less right up to the current moment. So if you look, there was it came out that the British military, the Ministry of Defense, had people over there last year having secret meetings with Azov. Right. Well, with Ukraine's National Guard, but Ukraine's National Guard incorporates Azov, so it's basically Azov battalion.
It's connected with the government. It's not independent.
Right. And so this was published a few months ago on a website called Declassified UK. And the interesting thing is, so you had British military representatives over there training them and having meetings with them. And I think the impression I get is that the British wanted. The MOD, the Ministry of Defense, basically wanted to deny it and pretend it didn't happen, but unfortunately, the Azov published it on their own website, including photos of the meeting. So right. they couldn't actually deny it. But there's still no official record in the UK of any such meetings, even though they clearly happened. And then you look, something virtually identical happened with the Canadian military around the same time. This was last year. and this was covered. I think the Ottawa Citizen reported on this, where Canadian military were training Azov and working with one of the other neo-Nazi groups. I think Centuria is what I'm seeing over here. But yeah, so I mean, you can't. There's no deniability. I mean, if the military of if the military are meeting with these people in advance of this, and there's training going on, and presumably there's funding and financing going on, there's no one can make the claim of ignorance, like, oh well, we didn't know that they had this ideology, or
Right.
and it's the same with the media. The media can't, because the media at the moment, well, since the Russian invasion started, the media have, I don't think they've even once mentioned the neo-Nazi element whatsoever, as far as I'm aware. And this includes the television news media, as well as the newspapers and all of that. But they were mentioning it, over the last 8 years. There's articles being published in mainstream news, in the Guardian, in the New York Times. There was one published as recently as January this year in Time magazine, which was about the Azov and the neo-Nazis in Ukraine. And to get them to talk about that now is impossible. But this was like 3 months ago that they were willing to talk about it then. But now, since the invasion has happened, and now everything has gone into kind of wartime propaganda and nonsense, no one wants to mention it. Suddenly it's as if these neo-Nazis don't exist, and this issue has never been there.
Right, but you make the point that Putin does want to mention it, but nobody on the Western media addresses what he said as him being serious, right?
Yeah, I mean, they basically, the response was, he's crazy, or he's a fantasist, or he's trying to recreate the Soviet Union or something, or he's just inventing this kind of pretext for invasion and all of that, which I'm sure there's some element of that in there. Okay, but it's crazy. And then also to turn it around, and all the memes now suggesting that Putin is the new Hitler, and having him with the mustache, the Hitler mustache, and all that kind of stuff. Which, given who the main enemy is from his perspective in Ukraine, that's kind of extraordinary. That's like pot calling the kettle black, I guess. It's
right. But I mean, this whole conflict, the lead up to the invasion, was this low-level Nazi-supported attack upon ethnic Russians, right? So that was part of the thing that was kind of something like a thorn in the paw of Putin, right?
Sure, yeah, and this was going on from 2014, from the revolution onwards. So the militias had been basically, from what I understand, shelling those areas, the Donbass and the ethnic Russian areas, more or less non-stop for 8 years. So there's kind of already been a low-level war been going on for 8 years. It's only in the last month or so that it's really been, because I mean, people are acting like the war started a month ago, when really it's probably, you'd probably say the timeline is a lot longer. Which is not to, and I'm not actually, it's not to justify Putin's invasion, or the Russian invasion. Because I find that questionable whether it was the right thing to do. Certainly militarily invading a sovereign state and all of that. I'm not justifying that or defending it, but again, it's as you said at the beginning, it's all this context that's been removed, so that we just get this very black and white kind of binary narrative of good and evil.
Right, and he has. I mean, in some ways, he hasn't bombed a lot of civilian, maybe Mariupol or something like that. There's been civilian bombings, but some people have argued that he could have done something like what they did in World War II, which is just a massive artillery bombing and things like that. But it really is incredible, this whole Azov thing, because on Facebook you could praise the Azov battalion, right? So you see these very weird things. Israel supporting the Azov battalion, and I think you mentioned. Can you talk about the UN vote that took place, and about the condemnation of Nazism?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Actually, just that you just mentioned Israel supporting the Azov battalion. I mean, Israel was selling weapons directly to the Azov battalion from 4 or 5 years ago. So, which is extraordinary, really. Again, you're talking neo-Nazis and actual, who kind of hero worship specific World War II Nazi collaborators and stuff in Ukraine, and you've got Israel, selling them weapons. It makes no sense. But so in December there was a resolution in the UN. Um, one of these things that was put forward was they wanted all of the governments to basically issue an official condemnation of Nazism, or of the glorification of Nazism and the glorification of Nazi symbols, right? And it's one of these things, there are all these kinds of votes, I'm sure, go on all the time. Right. And only two governments flat out refused to make that condemnation, and that was the United States and Ukraine. There were a handful of governments that also abstained, and that included Britain, Australia, and Canada, and a lot of the European Union countries. And from what I understand, most of the rest of the world, the third world countries, the Middle East, Africa, Asia, they condemned Nazism, they went along with it. But it's really interesting who didn't, or who refused to.
It's incredible. I thought it was fake. When I read that on your thing, I had never heard that. I thought it was fake. I had to go do some research, and it was all verified. It's on Consortium News. I can put the link.
Sure, yeah.
But it's incredible because we live in this kind of woke, touchy-feely Biden administration, but they would never tell you they couldn't condemn Nazism because they're in deep in Ukraine. So it's really, it's unbelievable, the silence here in the media of the U.S. about that.
Well, yeah, and also because I guess that no one's ever been pulled up on this by Western media or journalists. But how would you even defend it? How would you, if you were challenged, how would you justify not condemning Nazism?
I don't know. I'm not condemning. Like, no action is an action. So it's unbelievable. Like, especially considering we fought a war against there. Obviously the UK did too, but it's off the charts. Only the Ukraine and the United States could not condemn it. Wow, it's unbelievable. That's just
I know, and also Britain and Australia and Canada and everyone else just abstaining. Why would you even abstain? It doesn't make any sense.
Right, it doesn't make any sense. And you really go into, in one of your articles, you talk about some of these characters, but you showed a video of a guy kind of bragging about how much support he was getting from outside of Ukraine, right? It was Yevhen Karas. Do you remember that video?
Yeah, so he's the leader of a group called C14, one of they're one of the Nazi groups, and I came across this video. Yeah, it's pretty extraordinary, this video, what he's saying, because he's so open. He's not trying to be clever or anything, and he's kind of bragging, I think. Yeah, he's basically saying, this is fantastic. They're giving us all these weapons, and we get to go and fight and kill, and and then, he's treating it, I don't know, man, he's treating it like he's a kid in a candy shop. It's amazing.
He brags that he has as many javelins as anybody else, right? So this is before the invasion. He's bragging about having all of these high-tech weapons. It's really incredible. These Nazis, literal Nazis. Yeah.
I think he was bragging that they have more than the UK does. So, that's amazing. And yeah, this was in early February, so this was maybe a couple of weeks before the invasion happened. Yeah, and again, but you have to look for this stuff. This stuff isn't, you're not going to find this stuff. Certainly, you're not going to find it in the mainstream. But you have to dig this stuff out because it's not being widely shared or anything like that.
Right. It really is something else. And this goes in. So Zelensky is Jewish. He's seen as this person who's a democratic hero, right? That's the way he's being portrayed in this propaganda. But then he just said that 11 left-wing parties were banned, right, within the last week or so. So he's clearly not that. But he's had far-right Nazi-type people in his administration, right?
Yeah. Yeah, the thing with the thing with
Sternenko,
that guy, he wanted to. I don't know if he was actually in the administration, but certainly Zelensky wanted to appoint him, or certainly approached him. And so this is the guy, Sternenko. He's the leader of, or he's the former leader of the right sector one of the big neo-Nazi groups, and Zelensky wanted to appoint him as the head of the Secret Service. Which is insane. And this guy's also like, he's under suspicion of being involved in a massacre in 2014. So there was a massacre in Odessa where basically, I think it was something like 85 people were murdered. They were basically trapped in like a trade union house, and the neo-Nazi kind of mob basically set it alight with all of them inside, and they all burned to death. So yeah, it's just crazy. Like, it's the kinds of people we're talking about is just crazy. Zelensky, I don't know. Zelensky, it could just be a puppet, just an actor. I mean, he was an actor, but I mean, he could just. I mean, people like to throw in your face, well, he's Jewish, so how can he be? If the president is Jewish, how can they be far right? But that's ridiculous. That's like saying, oh, Obama's president of America, therefore there's no such thing as the KKK. I mean, it's like, right. It doesn't work that way. I mean, he's there. The president is a short-term position. He comes and goes, but I guess what you want to call the deep state, or the permanent presence of the far right and the neo-Nazis, they're in the security services, they're in the police force, they're in the armed forces, they're in the secret service, and all of that. So what do they care who's president? Because that's going to change in 4 years' time. I mean, that doesn't mean anything. So,
and I mean, that was I think you wrote in one of your articles, that was the real winner of the revolution in 2014 was these hardcore Nazis, right? And I think that guy was bragging about it. Yevhen Karas in that video was saying, yeah, we're the smallest amount, but we were the most active, right? So that Nazi involvement in 2014 was legit. Is that correct?
Yeah, because one of the counter arguments that often gets used is, well, because they basically play a numbers game, and they'll say, well, it's a small minority, and stuff like that. But then, as he was, from the horse's mouth, as he was saying himself, it's not about the numbers; it's about the level of influence and on events that those numbers are having. So it doesn't matter, because I mean, the other thing people will point to is they'll say, well, look, they have so little representation in parliament, so they can't be that prevalent. Well, again, it's parliament is one thing. These elected officials come and go every 4 years. It doesn't mean anything. But if you're even if you are a minority, if you're present in large numbers in the armed forces and the secret service and all of that kind of stuff, the state apparatus, then it doesn't matter. You've got control. You've basically got control. So. And yeah, that's kind of what this guy was saying. He was basically saying, that this wasn't because they like to sell it as this was like a liberal revolution of right. Ukrainians, a populist, and it just doesn't. The evidence doesn't back that up. I mean, certainly a lot of people may have been swept up in it and not known what was really going on. And this is where you draw the comparisons again to Libya and Syria, where I'm sure you had all these genuine protesters who were protesting for change and more democracy and all this kind of stuff, probably not even aware the extent to which foreign intelligence agencies were involved in what was going on, and Al Qaeda and the arms, the weapons coming in and all that kind of stuff. So. I'm sure lots of Ukrainians, like lots of Libyans, were not aware at the time necessarily.
Right. And I mean, I think the number was the U.S. spent $5 billion. That's a tidy sum in a country like that. So they definitely put some weight behind the 2014 overthrow. I think the guy who got kicked out was duly elected, right? If I remember correctly.
Yeah. I mean, whether he was corrupt and whatever, a Russian puppet and all that stuff you can argue that as well. But yeah, I think he was duly elected. Sure.
Right. And it's kind of the same characters around Victoria Nuland, right? So she was there before Trump. Now she's back, and she has connections. I think her dad was kind of a bigwig in Ukraine, so she knows that country very well. And I think that she's the Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs. Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to ask you actually. Do you happen to know? So this was 2014. So is that when Hillary was still State Department, or was she already gone by then?
I don't know. I think that she was there all the way to 2016. I don't think she had left yet, right? I think that her time was there, so that means that she was still around.
Because that basically means that all this stuff, Libya, Syria, Ukraine, Arab Spring, all of it, all happened while she was running the State Department. Right.
It's incredible.
That's amazing. That's an amazing, yeah, that's an amazing record.
Secretary of State till 2013. So I guess she left after 2013. I don't know who took over after her.
Okay, well,
but it's still under Obama, right? So it's still the same people. It's Biden's the vice president, right? It's probably the same. It's the same administration.
sure, yeah, yeah. So the one thing I will say is, to Obama's credit, he did try to block the arms sales to Azov, to Ukraine. I think in 2015, probably because he kind of realized this isn't a good idea. These guys are, are Nazis or whatever. But then that got reversed. It got reversed by Trump, and then I think Biden just didn't go back to the Obama policy of blocking it. So, and now, if you notice now, basically the weapons are just flowing in like no one's business. I mean, from all directions.
Right. People are giving them away. They're not even selling them. They're just giving it to them. And you can kind of tell that if you look at some of these military things, these javelins and these missiles, anti-tank missiles, are having a terrible effect. I mean, they're really just blowing these tanks away. So I don't know how much more time Russia can, spend. I don't know. There's clearly probably, I think you said there's probably all kinds of special forces from outside countries in Ukraine right now, right?
Well, there are, yeah, and it's confirmed. I mean, so it's confirmed. I've seen it confirmed that there's SAS, British SAS are on the ground, Canadian Special Forces, Israeli Special Forces, and then I would assume American Special Forces, but I don't know if that's true or not. But yeah, there's. I don't know at what point they were on the ground, whether it was from even before the invasion or whether it's just recently. But
right. And I mean, you asked the question about all of this Nazism. Why is it being covered up? I mean, is it too? It would just destroy the whole current narrative, right? If people knew how serious the Nazi issue was there, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's this whole carefully constructed propaganda program that's going on right now, and again, it's the same. Again, it's the same playbook as Libya and Syria, because it's the same reason they covered up the Al Qaeda situation in Libya. You got Gaddafi saying, "This is Al Qaeda that's fighting us." They've come in from the outside, and you've got the Western media basically laughing at him, saying he's going crazy, he's losing his marbles, and all that kind of stuff. And it's the same thing with what they're saying with Putin now. I just, obviously nothing can get in the way of the propaganda. There's this whole program that's, even all of the language, the prefabricated kind of language of comparing Putin to Hitler and talking about, war crime. War crimes keeps coming up, every couple of days, war crimes or genocide. I haven't seen any evidence of genocide whatsoever, but, it's all just, it's so insidious. And obviously, yeah, if you start mentioning, the extent to which the Nazism is embedded in the Ukrainian militias and all this kind of stuff in the state, then people are going to start second guessing it. But it's quite hard to get that message across. Even I encounter resistance from people, who think I'm just swallowing Russian propaganda and all that kind of stuff. So
fascinating. I mean, and you talk about this, you kind of go in detail about the attack on the maternity hospital. So you see that sympathetic propaganda, and that story was just put out all over the world. So you're back at this hospital. I think that was the original propaganda of World War I, was the German soldiers going into a Belgian hospital and stabbing kids. So this is almost its equivalent. I mean, so the bombing of the children's hospital. I'm not saying it didn't happen, but it hits that emotional chord, right?
Yeah, well, yeah. So I wrote about this last week because I came across something as well. So a few days ago, it got reported. It wasn't like made a big deal, because I think the maternity hospital thing was maybe a week and a half ago. 5 or 6 days later, it got reported that one of the women who was photographed escaping the maternity hospital, being carried out on a stretcher. It's a famous photo, it was on all the front covers of all the newspapers and stuff. That woman subsequently died 5 days later, I think. And they didn't. This wasn't a big media story that she died. Like I saw it in some of the newspapers and stuff like that. But I was looking at this, and what really struck me was that she hasn't been identified or named. And I know you could say, I mean, you could make the argument, maybe her family wanted her to be anonymous or didn't want her to be named or anything like that. But if you actually read the text of these articles, that's not what they're saying. What they're actually saying is uh, the doctors weren't able to get her name because they didn't have time, right?
Right. Right.
Which I find that extraordinary. Like, firstly, it was 5 days later, so you've had 5 days to get her name. Okay. Uh, Secondly, the articles also say that her father and husband came to collect the body after she died, so they must have known her name, right? uh, I don't know how you would have established contact with her husband and father in this unless you knew her name, because how would you know who to get in touch with? Um, so this business of her being unidentified is really odd to me, because her picture's been all over the world. And if you read these articles, I mean, so I've linked to some of them on the site as well. These articles are basically all, and they're in all the newspapers, right? But they're basically, the text is almost identical, so that they're obviously copying and pasting from like a common source, which I've looked into it. It turns out it's a AP, Associated Press piece, which basically is like it looks like a basically like a press release that went out, and then all the media basically just copied and pasted it, right? But it's really badly written. It looks like it's written by someone whose first language isn't English, and the description of what happened is so lacking, because it's basically just saying this woman died. We don't know her name. The doctors didn't find out. But this is, she's another victim of this horrendous war crime, carried out by the Russians, by Putin. And that's it. And it's like, we're not even going to look into her name or who she was.
Right.
So
And they
so
never
that's the
will. They never will. It'll never be. Nobody will try to figure it out, because it looks like a staged event to me. Like they're
Okay.
walking through a bombed out thing, and
Well, I
the
mean, yeah.
cameras are
So
there.
yeah.
It
So the
looks
Russian foreign ministry claimed that the building in question wasn't an active maternity hospital. It used to be, but it had no patients or doctors in it at this point. It was being used by the Azov as a firing position, basically, and they had weapons there and stuff. So and you've got to just use logic. I mean, pure logic. Why would the Russian military attack a maternity hospital? It's strategically worthless. It's a PR disaster as well, right?
right.
It makes absolutely no sense. And what they were saying was, no, the Azov took over this building, probably because they wanted us to destroy it, so that they could say we just destroyed a maternity hospital. And they staged these photos with these actors. Two women were photographed at the scene. These have become iconic photos. One of them is the one I just mentioned on the stretcher, who's apparently subsequently died. The other one, it turns out, is a beauty blogger. Yeah, she's a beauty blogger, so she's a reasonably well-known figure in Ukraine. And the Russians claim that basically these were staged photos that she was involved in. Involving the Associated Press photographers and stuff like that. And again, just logic. Why would you attack a maternity hospital?
Doesn't make sense. Why would you waste a bomb on that? It would be just not useful. And there's other things, like they're countering this whole story. Like the Russians are very much involved in the UN about these bio labs that the Defense Department was funding in the Ukraine. Can you talk about? And then they kind of turn that story around. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So yeah, this one's tricky, because the talk of the biolabs in Ukraine goes back a while, but it wasn't something I really looked at until recently, until it came up again, until the Russians basically brought it up. Now, obviously, these biolabs in Ukraine are there. I mean, they're not. No one's denying that they exist. There's supposed to be about a dozen of them scattered across Ukraine, but I think the Russians are claiming there's more than that. And these are labs that appear to be. I mean, the problem is the US basically says that they're Ukrainian-run labs, and that the US involvement is purely, they're just, they're offering guidance on biosafety and dealing with dangerous pathogens and all this kind of stuff. But the Russian claim is that the US is actively involved in the labs. They're basically US-run labs run by the Department of Defense, and they just happen to be in Ukraine and involving Ukrainian staff and personnel and stuff. It's very difficult to actually figure out which version is true, or whether the truth is somewhere in the middle, because obviously the labs are there. we don't really know. I don't think they've really explained what's been going on at the labs and what kind of work's been done. I mean, they say it's been biosafety is the term that keeps coming up, and they talk about threat reduction work going on, but very little detail has been provided by the US. And if you saw Victoria Nuland being questioned about it a couple of weeks ago, it was pretty vague. And so, I mean, it's very difficult to. The Russians claim that they're working on bioweapons there, and the Russian military were talking about bioweapons that are specifically designed to target certain ethnic groups and stuff like that. The Americans call this laughable, but I mean, who knows? I mean, I do know that what everyone points to is that there was official documents on the U.S. Embassy in Kiev's website to basically confirm that these biolabs existed and that they were being run by the DoD. And those documents disappeared around the time that Russia started accusing the US of involvement. But then they reappeared a few days later. And because I didn't see the original documents, I don't know if the documents that reappeared are exactly the same or if they've been doctored and altered. So I'm not sure what happened there.
It would be the same thing that happened here in the States with financing things in Wuhan. There's tons of evidence they were involved in the Wuhan labs, and it was all covered up. And I mean, it wouldn't surprise me at all that the DoD was involved in that. So
yeah. Well, so the Russian foreign ministry was saying that the Ukrainians were the regime in Kiev was under instructions to either remove or dispose of as much as they could before the Russians arrived. Before the invasion reached those locations. So there was this scramble going on in the middle of February to remove as much of these materials and stuff as possible, or to destroy them. And Victoria Nuland, I think maybe by accident, seemed to confirm this in her Senate when she was speaking to the Senate a week ago, because she basically said when she was asked by Marco Rubio, she was asked about whether the Americans have military-run biolabs in Ukraine, and she basically said yes, and she basically said that they were trying to just remove whatever they could before the Russians got control, because they're worried about Russia getting their hands on these materials, which obviously implies that these materials there's something dangerous about them. Otherwise, why would they be that bothered? I would assume that Russia has its own labs, and has access to the same stuff. So,
right. But I mean, I think that the Russians allege that the bio weapons they're working on are aimed towards Russia, I think was what they were trying to say. But yeah, she pretty much admitted that. Nuland admitted that. And I mean, her husband is Kagan. There's a lot of very strange things going on. Her husband is Kagan, who's a known neocon. The current Secretary of State, Blinken, his stepdad was Robert Maxwell's family attorney. Did you know that?
I did not know that.
Yeah, look up Antony Blinken. His dad was basically the family attorney for Robert Maxwell. It's really incredible. So, and he worked. So it went Hillary Clinton, John Kerry. Blinken worked under Kerry. Then it went to Tillerson, I think, for a little while, and then it came back, and Blinken was the Secretary of State. Is the new Secretary of State. So there's all kinds of strange things. I don't know why the U.S. has any interest in Ukraine. It just doesn't. It's just not worth it. Like you called it I mean, your prediction was the long march towards war. You have a title of that from 2016, Psychopathic Politics, the long march towards war with Russia. I should have mentioned that earlier. Can you talk about that article?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we've been building up to this for so long. So at least 10 years, and what happens is when it gets played out for that long, it gets embedded into the popular consciousness that Russia is the enemy, and we're in the new Cold War, and all this kind of stuff. And so if you look at the last 10 years, I mean, you've got Russiagate and the Trump stuff, and then you've got Russia interfering with the elections, and you've got what happened in Syria, and then you've got Crimea and Ukraine, and it's all just built up for so long that when this eventuality comes along, which was inevitable, Russia eventually doing something in Ukraine, right? Everything's kind of in place. All the mental kind of conditioning is already there, so you can run these propaganda programs because they've already been running for 10 years, so it's easy, and so this must have all been planned way in advance. Because the thing that's odd is that I don't understand why we, and when I say we, I mean just the West in general, especially the United States. I don't understand why we rebooted the Cold War. I don't get it, because it just seemed like it didn't completely unnecessary. It seemed like Russia was, say what you want about Russia. I mean, I'm not defending. I mean, I think Putin is as corrupt as anyone, and I think the Russian establishment and the oligarchy and all that is as corrupt as anywhere else. I'm not painting them as like angels or anything like that, but they seem to be genuinely open to and trying to be on good terms with the United States and the West. Certainly up to a certain point in time. Uh, I don't think it was the Russians who rebooted the Cold War. I think it was us that rebooted the Cold War. There
I think
was
you're right.
even there was even a point, I think, in the late 90s, where it's been suggested that's kind of behind the scenes that Putin was even interested in Russia being a part of NATO, and was kind of asking questions in those directions, and that apparently the Clinton administration were kind of giving them the cold shoulder on that. But so it's not as if all of this was absolutely inevitable, and it's not as if most of this was coming from Russia. I think most of this has come from our side, in terms of setting up this paradigm of us versus Russia, which I mean, it was almost like less than 10 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the original Cold War. Why would we make it our policy to reboot it again and to recreate this?
It's a great question. It's an excellent question. And the NATO kept expanding, right? So Estonia and all of these kind of traditionally Russian influenced states became acquainted with NATO. So you're right. It's a long kind of march. It's a long buildup. And was it necessary? Is NATO necessary? I mean, I think that's an important question. The size of Russia. Do you know that Russia's economy is the size of the state of Texas? It's not. It's a huge landmass, but it doesn't have anything close to the sophistication of the U.S. Like just the state of California's economy dwarfs Russia. So,
well, I mean, yeah, and the question of is NATO necessary? I will balance that out a little bit by saying, for example, that I have a very good friend who lives in Estonia, right close to the Russian border, and from his perspective, and from what he tells me about people in Estonia, they would absolutely say that NATO is necessary, because they genuinely have a existential kind of fear of Russian invasion, or and they have really bad memories of being under the Soviets, obviously, and so there's that element, I guess. But in terms of, I mean, there is a question from a Russian perspective. Yeah, certainly there's a question of, is NATO particularly necessary? And when you look at the timeline and you look at the fact that allegedly Putin was even interested in becoming part of NATO, but was kind of blocked from that, or was basically told, that's probably not going to happen. Then on top of that, you have all this, you have the kind of diminishing of their buffers. They wanted a buffer zone, basically.
right.
So you have that diminishing, and then you have NATO, and then you have Ukraine, which was really always a red line. And then you have that, the threat of NATO joining Ukraine, which I think was enshrined into the Ukrainian constitution at the end of 2019, that they were moving towards NATO membership.
Yeah.
So there's all of that. And then I think a really big point is that I think 2011 was like a really big point, because I think Putin and I think the Russians were watching what happened in Libya, and because the thing about Libya, which a lot of people forget, is that it was a NATO operation. Okay, and what's really odd about that is that there was no reason for it to be a NATO operation. If the French and the American and the British governments wanted to go militarily intervene in Libya, they could have done that on their own. Using their own national, as like they didn't have to invoke NATO. They didn't have to involve the whole of NATO. There was no reason for it. Okay, but for some reason they invoked NATO. And so basically every NATO nation, I think apart from Germany, had bombers in the air over Libya, dropping bombs, right? It made no sense, because the whole point of NATO is that it's supposed to be a mutual defense pact, right? It's, an attack on one is an attack on all. Libya at that point had attacked nobody. They weren't threatening to attack any NATO member or anything like that. So why was NATO invoked instead of just the Americans and the British and French doing it themselves? And if you're Russian or you're Putin watching that, you're basically thinking, shit, that's going to be us in a few years. They're just going to, whatever the catalyst is, that's going to be us, and they can just come in and, they can invoke NATO, and they'll just, and then on top of
that's
that,
the Russian fear, right? So they got invaded by Napoleon, 1812, and then Germany, 1941, right? Huge invasions. So it's always been.
yeah, I mean, didn't they lose about 25 million people in World War II? The Russians.
Yeah,
I mean,
just incredible. 1/8 of the population was murdered.
Yeah.
1/8, like it's an incredible number. 1/4 were wounded. So like it was genocidal. I mean, Hitler made an extermination order. I mean, he did it. People think about the Holocaust, but he did that for Russians, exterminate. So that's kind of lost to history. But yeah, so I think that it's ingrained, and it's certainly ingrained in Putin, who grew up in St. Petersburg, which was, almost lost. So I mean, that was just a horrific fighting. I think his family was associated with all the fighting in, what was it, Leningrad at the time, or Stalingrad? No, Leningrad. So I think that they're painfully aware of a lot of being encroached upon, and that's really what the Nazis did, is encroached upon. Got close enough, built up the troops, and then invaded.
Yeah, and obviously the Ukraine, there was a huge Ukrainian Nazi collaboration going on as well. So and there's a lot of callback to that goes on now in Ukraine. With the kind of lionizing of those figures from history, and that's all part of the contemporary neo-Nazi thing as well. So yeah,
I mean, it really is incredible history. We're at a flashpoint. Like it's the things could go really dark. All these people have nuclear bombs, so people should be very, very concerned. Especially the leadership in the United States has got some questionable. I mean, Kamala Harris is a joke. Like she is. I mean, terrifying. She can't even talk off the top of her head. So
she hasn't. Yeah, she hasn't done anything, has she? I haven't seen her do anything.
No, which is kind of scary in a lot of ways, but I don't think she's effective at all. She did when she was in Poland. She didn't know where she was on the map. I got that sense. Here we are west of here, and we're north. She didn't seem to have a grip on anything having to do with the historicity of Europe or Eastern Europe. But really scary, very scary. I mean, you have people on there who, hopefully, the people who are running the administration are a little sharper. And the whole thing is incredible because Biden is very much in Ukraine. That's how our president got impeached. That's how Trump got impeached. Was this supposed call, and it was all twisted because there really was corruption based upon Hunter Biden's laptop and a lot of that stuff. So Illustrate for Life is asking that question. Sir Asaj, do you have time to take a few questions?
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, let's see. Have you watched Oliver Stone's Ukraine on Fire? I kind of looked through that.
Yeah, I did. I don't have a great memory of it, but yeah, I did. Yeah.
Do you have any ideas about Dugin, or like he's supposedly Putin's Rasputin or something? Do you know of anything about Dugin, and is he responsible for this invasion?
I can't answer. I mean, I have people who keep bringing that up and telling me about that. The problem is I haven't hugely looked into him. I just know that he's a very shady, dodgy figure.
And you talk about Semenyanka in one of your articles, right? This woman Nazi who she's around, right? She was influential in Ukraine.
Yeah, she was basically she was running the political wing of Azov. I think they were called the National Party or something like that. And yeah, there's all kinds of photos of her posing with Nazi swastika flags and giving the salute and all of that. And then I think she was invited to Austria as a visiting fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences or something like that. And it's just, I mean, you find these figures everywhere. When you look at the Ukrainian, this stuff has been pointed out by Amnesty International. It's been pointed out by mainstream press like Time Magazine and all of that. Like I said, not now, obviously, but I'm talking about in the previous months and previous years. And the picture they were painting was basically these guys. They're not only running the state there's state apparatus, but they're basically running the streets. I mean, there's patrols of these guys who are basically acting like the police force, going around enforcing the law. It's almost on an ISIS level, it seems like. And the war and the fighting and the access to weapons and all that is obviously going to make that even worse, depending on how this turns out in the future. They'll get even more control, really.
Right. And do you think that Ukraine is being intentionally used to distract from the pandemic?
No, I wouldn't think so, because this stuff predates the pandemic. I mean, this stuff was going on from 8 years ago. The pandemic is an interesting one, actually, because everyone seems to have forgotten about it. So it's a good question, but no, I don't think so. But
yeah, you write a lot about it on your blog, so people can check that out if they want to. It's all your COVID stuff.
Sure, yeah.
Let's see. Requirements are. What do you think about the vax as well as the digital ID requirements for all refugees? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, the digital ID thing is interesting, because this is something I covered a couple of years ago. I don't know if you've heard of the ID 2020 program. Do you know about this? So ID 2020 was a program that was being developed prior to the year 2020. Okay. It's being funded by Bill Gates, and it involved something called Gavi, which is the Global Alliance for Vaccine Initiatives. And their plan was using they were going to use two things as kind of like the initial pretext for this, which one was going to be refugees and stateless individuals, to get them kind of registered onto like a database, where through that they can have access to a unique kind of digital identity, and everyone would have this, and through that you can access banking and services and all that kind of stuff. And then the other thing was vaccination. They would use the plan was to use vaccination as kind of the pretext for getting everyone fitted with this digital kind of biometric ID, and the plan they envisioned was eventually everyone in the world, or certainly everyone being born as well, like babies, everyone being born after a certain point would have this digital imprint, this digital ID, and that would be their kind of unique login or avatar to the system, in order to conduct their finances or to access social benefits, or to do all this stuff. And they called it ID 2020. I don't know why the year 2020 was put into the title, because this was predating 2020. This was like going back to 2018, 2017 or something like that. And then obviously the pandemic happened in 2020, which is really odd. So whether the refugee thing, I mean, I don't know if the refugee thing is being used to push that along, but certainly I think there's a lot of talk of another pandemic coming over the next couple of years. This 2025 has been talked about, that there's fears of something called SPARS or something like that. So there's going to be opportunities for this stuff to get rolled out that goes beyond COVID as well, So, and now that we've had all this pandemic response and vaccination programs and stuff, I imagine that the kind of the system, the apparatus for all of this is in place, so that when the next thing rolls around, if they wanted to use that as a catalyst for something like ID 2020 and the digital biometrics and all that, they could do that very easily.
Right. And there's a ton of refugees. My understanding is that 1/4 of the population of Ukraine is left, which is 10 million people. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's an extraordinary amount of people distributed all over the world. Let's see. Oswald says Semenyanka was fired from the university in Vienna. Mid-2021, the articles are scrubbed from the net. That makes sense. Do you know much about the Hunter Biden laptop? Is that covered very much in the UK?
No, it's something I've only seen on social media, and to be honest, I haven't, because I've been looking into other elements of this. I haven't really looked into that. I mean, do you want to fill me in on that a little bit?
Well, I wish I could give you the full details, but he was clearly in Ukraine. He was making money. He was getting like $100,000 a month from one gas company and not really doing any work. I think he really showed up in Ukraine twice. And there's a famous clip of Biden telling this group, kind of boasting that this prosecutor better be fired or this whole deal's off, and it kind of bandied around. So there was very shady dealings in the Ukraine. And
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Zelensky apparently is a billionaire, but it's not clear how he became a billionaire, because I don't think he became a billionaire from acting.
Right.
He was on a TV shows.
Yeah, he's done
So
well. Well, I mean, we just passed at one point, we're like about to go off a dead cliff here in the States, and we passed a $1.5 trillion pork bill, which is just totally insane. And 15 billion of that, I think, goes to Ukraine. Imagine what that buys. I mean, who knows how that gets distributed? I mean, those were old scams. There were old scams. I can't remember when I was in DC, but there was a scam that these guys would get money and it would be distributed around the world, and then half of that would be kicked back or something like that. That's what I heard. So some of those
and
like, oh, we're going to give you some money, but you got to put some money back in this Swiss bank account. So,
and how much of this is being covered in the American news media? Any of it, or?
Well, I would say the laptop was they just got new coverage because there was something like 15 intel that blamed it on Russian disinformation. So there's the Russians again. And then it waited until there was a story in the New York Times to verify that. But anybody with a brain who could access the information, it was actually a huge part of the 2020 reelection of Trump because his handlers, Bannon and Giuliani, were harping on that as, showing the corruption of Biden supposedly, and they kind of slow rolled it. It was almost like something they tried to use, like Assange used the Podesta emails in 2016, which
Yeah.
Trump used. So this was kind of it, but it didn't have. It was shut out of the corporate media. They didn't even cover it, and I think that there's pictures in there that are disturbing. People have researched it, and his real name is Robert Biden, but Robert Hunter Biden. The sex stuff is off the charts, but also he had a lot of emails that supposedly people going through that show all of these shady deals and backdoor deals and all this crazy stuff. So,
yeah, it's like I said. I've been watching CNN, and I have to limit it. I can only do maybe 10 minutes at a time because it's so extraordinary. The level of and also I don't think anyone cares about the people in Ukraine anyway. I don't think any side of this. I don't think the Ukrainian government cares about the Ukrainian people. I don't think the West does, and I don't think Russia does. I think they're just pawns, or collateral, kind of same as the people in Libya, same as the people in Syria. It's all just psychopathic.
Yeah, they're psychopaths. I think the people here in the United States are psychopaths because the consequences can be immense. This is a flashpoint, man. This is all it takes is the wrong match.
Well, how do you see this going? How do you see this playing out?
Getting worse. With the people who are running my country right now, I just don't see it. I don't see it backing down. I think that they'll keep pushing, and then that'll force the hand of the Russians. I don't think this.
Yeah. And the thing is, you used to have voices of reason, such as Germany a lot of the time, or I don't know, countries like Sweden and stuff like that. And now they're just all sending weapons into Ukraine, even Germany, and everyone seems to have abandoned, nuance and context and stuff. It's all just like this 100% propaganda program. It's like this Mariupol thing. Everyone keeps going on about Mariupol. Okay, well, why is all the most devastating stuff happening in Mariupol? Well, it's because Mariupol is where the Azov are headquartered, right? That's their main base. So that's why it's intense, particularly intense in Mariupol, and these things are happening. But they don't tell you that on the mainstream news. They just make out that Mariupol, for some reason, the Russians are like being particularly brutal and committing war crimes and stuff. And again, I don't see what the evidence is of war crimes or of genocide, because they keep saying genocide. Zelensky said genocide in terms of the maternity hospital attack. And they said that in the maternity hospital attack, 3 people died. I'm sorry, but 3 people is not genocide. 3 people is very unfortunate and very sad, but I don't know how this language is being thrown about of genocide. And because what it's doing, it leads to a devaluation of what that word means, because that's a big word, right? And that's supposed to really mean something. And if you're just throwing it around really casual, really nonchalantly, like genocide and war crimes, it doesn't mean anything anymore, because when do you apply it? When it actually matters, what are you going to say then? When something does happen.
It's so true. I think there's a lot of irresponsible rhetoric. I even heard Newland talking about like, this is a righteous battle. against Russia. Like, there's nothing righteous about it. We don't have any stake in here. The United States does not have a stake in getting this. So I think people are realizing this is kind of like a feint. Like, okay, we can get them distracted about the misapplication of the vaccines. We can do it for the debt problems. I mean, it's incredible that, I mean, somebody's made the point that they're more concerned about a border between Ukraine and Russia when we don't have a border in the United States. So there's something really crazy going on. I it just it doesn't make sense.
Well, and also for Russia, this is an existential crisis,
Right.
but for us it isn't. For us, for the United States, it isn't. I mean, it could become one if it becomes like if it escalates to like a nuclear kind of situation. But for now, it's not at all. It's just, you know, it's just one more geopolitical chessboard. You know, it's not.
Right. No, you're right, and I think that's very telling, because it means that these people have a blasé attitude, but for the Russians, it's like we're living and dying. So that disharmony in that outlook, I think, is very telling, because they'll just keep poking them. I mean, I listened to one by John Mearsheimer. He kind of did an analysis of the background of that stuff, and I think that he was right. I think he was right in saying that Ukraine was a de facto member of NATO in a lot of ways. Like, they were getting in, and still are in a way. They're still getting weapons, just like you said. But I think that was what really antagonized the Russians, and so that's where we're at.
Yeah, and all of this is, by the way, no, I'm not actually defending the invasion or being like a pro Putin or pro Russian kind of apologist or anything like that, because I don't think the invasion was the right thing to do anyway. But nevertheless, you know, this propaganda campaign is ridiculous, because I just don't see where the war crimes have been committed. All I'm seeing is just the kind of damage and the kind of casualty figures that you would expect in a military operation of this type. It seems to have been like a quite targeted military operation. Certainly, the Russians didn't send in like the full force of their military. I mean,
no,
it was a relatively small. It was a smaller invasion force than you would expect, right? And
right. They said that Putin's holding back a lot of his top troops too, so it hasn't really come in. Yeah.
And they haven't used airstrikes. They haven't used aerial bombing. So I mean, they could have done that on day one. I mean, like, you know, when we invaded Baghdad, we were bombing on day one. We were bombing, you know, all the whole city. That hasn't happened. You know, there's none of that. So it's not like indiscriminate, you know, bombing or anything like that. It all seems to be relatively targeted, and obviously there are casualties, but there are always going to be casualties. You look at any military operation. You look at the stuff that we've done in Afghanistan or operations in Syria or Iraq. There were always civilian casualties. Not necessarily that we were targeting civilians, but there's going to be civilian casualties. Right. But except when Russia does it, it gets really blown up into this thing of like genocide, you know, war crimes, or, you know, they're deliberately doing it. Or
if Americans have any objectivity, which it's very hard here because of the amount of corporate propaganda. But if they have any objectivity, they should look at what the United States did in Iraq or in Afghanistan leading up to all this stuff. I mean, there were people just getting blown away. And I know people who went into Panama. I mean, the U.S.'s history is not, I mean, recent history too, within the last couple of decades. Yeah, I mean, so whose hero is a war criminal, right? Or it's I guess a matter of perspective. But yeah, the U.S. has been involved in some pretty dirty stuff. Iraq, I mean, that was a choice, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Is there anything you'd like to add? We're at about an hour here, Saj. Is there anything you'd like to add, or anything I missed before we wrap it up?
No, I mean, just you know, I wanted to gauge you a little bit on whether you get a sense that this could ever escalate to sort of like a nuclear kind of situation, or whether we would just never go down that road.
I hope not. And if the U.S. does something stupid, like crosses the territorial boundary, or, you know, I don't know. I just hope it wouldn't get to that. So I'm not optimistic. If you look at these people who run the country right now, Biden and Harris, you should be terrified. I mean, I'm terrified. So,
well, there's and plus,
what do you think? What do you think?
I mean, I really don't know. The thing that's worrying me at the moment is because of since the Russians basically made the biolabs talk, accusation. The American response was so extraordinary because they basically, in the same breath, they turned around and said, "Okay, we think Russia's planning a chemical attack in
Right.
Ukraine," right? And I just thought, why are you saying that? Why didn't you just say, okay, yeah, there's these biolabs. This is what happens there. This is what we've been doing. It's all above board. This is Russian disinformation, right? That would have been fine. Instead, they turned it around immediately and said Russia's going to carry out a chemical attack in Ukraine, and they're going to make it look like the Ukrainians did it. You know, and I don't. It's like you're so obviously telegraphing what's about something that's going to happen, or that you think is going to happen, or that you're setting up to happen. Um, and so then which is the Syria playbook all over again. But then I worry that that's what's going to be used as kind of the red line uh, for the US or NATO to maybe intervene militarily or something. And then I don't know where it goes from there. That's the problem.
I mean, I think Biden, in a moment of lucidity, which is very strange, said that a no-fly zone over Ukraine is a declaration of war, so they're not going to do that. So I'm glad they seem to have that sense. But there's nothing in the Eastern Europe that any American has to die for. There's really nothing. This isn't World War II. This is something that is built up over time, and there's no cooler heads to prevail, which is really kind of this shameful thing. So, yeah, I'm just not optimistic. I don't. The character of the people, the elites who run this country, like the American people, don't make the foreign policy decisions, but the character of the elites, for me, is totally detached from the day-to-day life of the average American. So they can just make crazy decisions because there's no consequence. So, yeah, it's just not a great. It's not a great situation here for the U.S. Not at all.
But we seem to have come from an era. I was growing up in an era where the Cold War was over, right? And really the kind of fear of nuclear Armageddon, nuclear war and all that was kind of over as well. It kind of went away, and we were kind of in a new. I really, for the life of me, do not understand why it all got rebooted and brought back to this situation.
I think
it's
that
crazy.
The elites here in the U.S. have found the Russians to be the boogeyman, like the WWE boogeyman all the time for all kinds of stuff, whether it's Hillary Clinton and her crew making up this whole thing that Russia, I mean, the propaganda that Trump was involved with Russia was overwhelming drumbeat here in the States. Like you couldn't not get it from anyone outside of the corporate media. But I think that they just use it for use this Russia, hoax type thing as a distraction from a lot of other things. And then they just pound on it and kind of get away from a lot of other stuff. So like for here, the COVID just dropped off in February. Like all the COVID news is gone. Now we just talk about Russia, Russia, Russia. So,
well, yeah, over here they just maybe a couple of weeks before the invasion, they just dropped all the restrictions, and they said you don't even have to wear masks anymore, really, which is it was a complete U-turn. It was incredibly strange. Yeah.
No, these are strange days. These are strange days. So I just hope we don't get nuked. I mean, there's been situations we went through the Cold War, if you remember, the Russia, the Cuban Missile Crisis. These are things where they were right on the edge, and cooler heads prevailed. But I don't know if those cooler heads are here.
Well, and the thing I don't see, the thing that gets me is what we were saying. Putin and Russia, if you go back long enough, say prior to the last 10 years, were not antagonizing us. They were not trying to have a adversarial relationship with the West or with the US. They were trying to go in the opposite direction, and we kind of just messed that all up, either on purpose or just through incompetence. I would assume on purpose, right? But this is also, I mean, if Gaddafi was basically working with the US on counterterrorism and trying to eliminate Al Qaeda and all this in war on terror, and so like we turn on these people while they're helping us almost, and it just doesn't. I don't get it. It's really odd.
It's very odd, and there's some other agenda that isn't kind of what the average American would want, would be my statement, is that they're selling arms, they're making changes, they're distracting the people from problems. Like we just passed a 1.5 trillion dollar bill when inflation's going up. Like we're going to have food inflation here in the States. It's a much bigger issue than some border war between Ukraine and Russia. So I think that there's kind of like a distractive element with this whole war, and how they play what they call it here is the mighty Wurlitzer, right? This huge propaganda machine. So,
and the American public in general, would you say, what is the general public perception of all this? Is it, are they going along for this kind of psyop, or are they not really interested?
Think, it's kind of like a different tier, a class tier, maybe, where people get their information from different spots, but the TV watching generation is into, in my opinion, the whole Putin is a bad guy. The Russians, the evil Slav. It used to be the evil Germanic horde. Now it's the evil Slav. So the very simple kind of worldview, I think, is middle America maybe falls for it, but they're more like people like me and the alternative media. Nobody believes this, and they think they're crazy. Like this is unnecessary. This is a ginned up war. It's not something that we should be involved in, is my opinion. And kind of the people I think are in the alternate media are kind of like flummoxed, like what is going on? Why do we even care? So there's actually, I think some of these people are sympathetic to Putin's ideas on the alternative media. Like I saw Alex Jones, for example, alternative media. He showed Putin's speech which they would never show in the corporate media, Putin's speech with subtitles explaining himself without like calling him crazy for talking about Nazis, which I think, in my opinion, is totally legitimate if you look at the facts of what's happening in Ukraine and has been happening in Ukraine. So I think that you have to kind of look at who believes what in the American, and who's a sucker for obvious political propaganda and who isn't. So unfortunately, America has a lot of
propaganda. Well, I mean, over here, everyone's kind of fallen for it and got swept up in like I kind of call it hysteria, like a psychosis,
the mass formation psychosis.
Well, and everyone was people were using the glory to Ukraine hashtag a lot and stuff like that, and not realizing that's it goes back to the Nazi days. It was like that was their salute, glory to Ukraine, the Nazi collaborators.
Slava Ukraina, or here I am, Slava. Thank you.
Yeah, and all these people, all these journalists, and all these kids are using it now, like probably not knowing what it means or where it came from. So it's pretty amazing.
Here's a perfect example of the power of the media and propaganda machine here. There was a stat that said 50% of the people were convinced that Saddam Hussein did 9/11 at a certain point. So they pounded on that so hard. They actually turned it from the cave-dwelling lunatic, bin Laden, to Hussein, and they convinced a lot of people that Hussein was involved. So I wouldn't be surprised today if the elites here say that we got to, call Putin the baddie and do this. It's very irresponsible. You do not want to have a nuclear war. I mean, it's just, I don't understand. So I kind of liken the current America to kind of a late stage cult where the people have been so inured to propaganda and being cheated by the elite that the elite has total contempt for them, no connection to them, and maybe a serf's life would have been better for the U.S. population. I'm not exaggerating. That's not hyperbole. Some of these people are totally in debt. The average American, if they haven't, this is a statistical fact. If they have a $400 bill, they cannot pay it. So that $400 bill would just throw people off. Like that would throw them into, living on the street. So, so the American late stage cult, I think, is an accurate application towards the average American. So, and that's the vaccines are hurting people and damaging people. They're not really vaccines. Anyway, I'm not supposed to talk about that on YouTube. So anyway, I'll probably get a strike for that. But anyway, late stage cold America. So this whole Russian war is totally unnecessary. I think the people who are doing it are maniacs. Why do you think they're restarting the Cold War?
Oh, that's what I was asking you. Hoping that you would have some. I can't understand it from any perspective. I can't understand it from a foreign policy perspective. I can't understand it from a security perspective. I don't get it. I know that when Victoria Nuland was in Ukraine in 2014 doing all her stuff, along with John McCain and whoever else, I know that some of the European governments, especially Germany and France, were not happy with what she was doing and what she was saying, because some of the European countries are much more dependent on Russia, and they kind of need good relations with Russia in a way that the United States doesn't. Um, and they weren't happy with what was going on. That's kind of being brushed under the carpet now, but at the time they certainly weren't happy with what was going on. Um, I don't know who's benefit. I don't know who's benefiting from this. Certainly not the Ukrainian people.
No, I don't think the American. I think that the increase in prices are going to have a disastrous effect. The gas prices here in the States will have impact food prices, living wage, all kinds of stuff. So they're stirring the pot, and I don't think it's for the better. So maybe it just helps the elite sell more weapons and gets rid of some useless eaters or whatever. I don't really know. It doesn't make sense. So anyway,
well, yeah. My fear also is that the situation in Ukraine, and I was saying this like 5 or 6 years ago, that they could easily convert this into an ISIS type situation where you have this instability there, you have this war going on, you have all these foreign volunteers going over to take part and to take up weapons and to become radicalized and to join the Azov and to do all this stuff, and then that they might start to spread out of Ukraine into other countries, and like you were saying, there was already connections to stuff that was happening in America, and there was the Christchurch shooter guy.
Right, he Bennett. What was his name? Brenton Tarrant. Yeah,
right.
Brenton.
He'd been in. I think he'd had some involvement with Azov, and he'd been in Ukraine. So with what, because now the floodgates are open. Now it's like, okay, everyone can go to Ukraine. We've got all this special forces over there, volunteers from everywhere, weapons flowing freely. Zelensky basically, handed out weapons to everyone. Anyone who wants weapons can come and get them, which is questionable, I think. So there's a real danger of an ISIS type situation where these extreme far right militias, they get this kind of hands-on experience of warfare and violence, and they have this bloodlust, and then with their ideology as well, they then take that back to their home countries and start spreading this stuff around, carrying out attacks, and then who knows where it goes from there, because that's really what happened with ISIS, right? I mean, it just started as it just started as a small fanatical bunch of and then you got intelligence agency support and financing and covert funding and weapons and arming, and then it just spirals, and before you know it, they're in multiple countries and
metastasizing globally. And I think that video, or reference to that video that you had, showed that guy had some kind of background. People are giving them the top weapons. So I would say that, and that's always been in the argument about the far right. I know that some of the far right guys, at least in the UK, were part of the Gladio movement, but it's always been a question about how much intel was behind the far right. And like ONA too, right? Like somebody came up with a very sophisticated kind of cult thing, but some people have wondered, what's the interest? Is this a seeding thing? Is this a farming thing? Are they looking to find the biggest maniacs? I mean, I think those are pertinent questions. So, that's the same thing here. Like some intel guy on Ukraine is going, okay, these are our next leaders right here. These are the far right guys we're going to support. They had a huge one here. I don't know if you heard about that, but there was a guy here who was a member of the Temple of Blood, and he was an FBI informant for like 15 years. And they had paid him like $150,000 or something crazy. But
wow.
So he had an intel background and a lot. Yeah. So there's the far right. There's a lot of stuff going on. So anyway, I really am feeling uncomfortable about this whole Ukraine situation. Things can spiral out of control. I mean, you can look at the start of World War I and how it started. It was not inevitable. Just people started, mobilizing, and next thing you knew, there was a war. So right now, people are probably subtly mobilizing. Like, okay, let's put our ducks in a row. Let's figure out if we're prepped. So,
well, World War One took a lot less than this, right? A lot less provocation than this. So
yeah.
we're kind of, I guess we're kind of holding out. We're kind of, I don't know if cooler heads are prevailing, but we're at least holding out the worst case scenario at the moment and not going down that road.
Well, I think that's a good way to end it. I mean, Saj, where's the best place for people? Your blog is the Burning Blogger, right? It's Burning Blogger now. It used to be something different when it was on WordPress, right?
Yeah, it used to be the Burning Blogger of Bedlam. That got taken down by WordPress. So yeah, now it's burningblogger.com. That's basically it. And you can support me on the site. You can support me financially via PayPal, via the site as well. Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter. It's @burningblogger, but I don't I don't post that often, so it's probably not worth it.
But you're on there. I mean, you can get their contact information, your social media,
sure.
all through Burning Blogger, and I will put Burning the Blogger. I will put the link to your blog on the podcast show notes so people can click through there. But really great conversation. Go back and listen to, if people are listening, go back and listen to our earlier conversation about the Libya conspiracy and Middle East politics. I think that Libya it seems hauntingly familiar to what's going on in the Ukraine of all these meddlers and all this stuff like that. But it's great to have you back on. Thanks so much for your time.
It was great being here. Thank you, William.
All right, take care. Stay there.